At the very top of the Ford empire lived two sisters who had everything: money, beauty, a father whose word could move markets. Magazines put Charlotte and Anne Ford on their covers. Entire cities paid attention when they walked into a room. But being born at the center of something that enormous comes with a gravity all its own. What happened to these two sisters is not a simple story of wealth or excess. It is something far more human than that: the world they were born into. To understand Charlotte and Anne Ford, you first have to understand their father, not the legend, not the chairman of the board, but the actual man who shaped everything that came after him. Henry Ford II was born on September 4th, 1917, in Detroit, Michigan, the oldest son of Edsel Ford and the oldest grandson of Henry Ford. The man who had built the company, changed American manufacturing forever, and created one of the greatest industrial fortunes the world had ever seen. From the moment Henry II arrived, the weight of that legacy was already there, waiting for him. He grew up in a house called Fair Lane in Dearborn, and later in the Edsel and Eleanor Ford estate on Lake St. Clair in Grosse Pointe Farms, a 50-room mansion on the water that looked more like a private country than a home. He attended the Hotchkiss School in Connecticut, then Yale, where he was a social fixture rather than an academic one. He never graduated. His grandfather, the original Henry Ford, died in 1947, but the family had already summoned Henry II back from the Navy 2 years earlier, in 1945, to rescue the company from the drift it had fallen into. He was 27 years old, and he stepped into the role with a seriousness that surprised people who had dismissed him as a playboy. He spent the next 3.5 decades turning Ford Motor Company from a failing, mismanaged post-war enterprise into a publicly traded global corporation. He served as president from 1945 to 1960, CEO from 1947 to 1979, and chairman of the board from 1960 to 1980. He launched the Ford GT40 program that broke Ferrari's dominance at Le Mans, winning 4 consecutive times from 1966 through 1969. He hired and then famously fired Lee Iacocca. His reason, when pressed, was characteristically blunt. He said sometimes you just don't like somebody. He gave the Mustang its place in American culture. He took the company public in 1956, raising $650 million. He was known as Hank the Deuce, a nickname that carried equal parts affection and wariness, and he ran the company as if it were a personal possession, which in many ways it was. He also had an outsized personality in every other direction. He liked to drink. He liked women. He liked yachts and art and the company of people who were as large as he was. The combination of enormous professional authority and a restless, expansive private life meant that the man his daughters grew up watching was always at least 2 people at once: the serious industrialist who showed up in boardrooms and the reckless one who did not particularly care, in certain moods, what the world thought of him. He also, in 1940, married a woman named Anne McDonnell, tall, composed, deeply Catholic, and the daughter of a prominent New York family. They were married at Southampton by Bishop Fulton J. Sheen, in a ceremony that received the kind of coverage normally reserved for royalty. Their marriage would last 24 years and produce 3 children: Charlotte, born April 3rd, 1941, Anne, born in 1943, and their son, Edsel Ford II. The girls grew up at the very center of American aristocracy. Their childhood was divided between a triplex on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, the family estate on Lake St. Clair, and summers at the compound in Southampton. They were educated at strict Catholic boarding schools. Charlotte attended the convent of the Sacred Heart in Norriton, Connecticut. They traveled to Europe every season as a matter of course, the way other children went to summer camp. They met the presidents and the diplomats and the heads of industry who came through their father's orbit as naturally as they encountered anyone else. Charlotte was the older one, poised, image-conscious, strong-willed, with the kind of bearing that photographs compress into something almost regal. She had her mother's composed elegance and her father's determination. Anne was 2 years younger, a bit softer in temperament, more naturally playful, the one who made people laugh. By the time both of them approached adulthood, they were among the most famous young women in America. Not because of anything they had done, but because of what they had been born into. They were also, in certain ways that only became clear later, two women growing up in the shadow of an enormous figure whose expectations shaped the air around them. Henry Ford II did not produce daughters who were idle or empty. Neither Charlotte nor Anne was that. But the world they moved in offered very few paths that were entirely their own, and the paths that were available were defined almost entirely by who they would marry and what that would mean for the family name. And then everything their childhood had been built on began to change. The divorce that changed the shape of their world. In 1964, Henry Ford II and Anne MacDonald Ford divorced after 24 years of marriage. It was not a surprise to the people closest to them. The tension between Henry's loud, expansive, restless personality and Anne's cool, contained dignity had been building for years. Henry had been conducting an affair with an Italian woman named Maria Cristina Vettore, stylish, international, entirely unlike the first Mrs. Ford in almost every way. When the divorce came through, it landed in the press like a stone in still water. Society pages tracked every detail. Detroit watched. The country watched. For Charlotte and Anne, both already in their early 20s, the divorce was the moment the ground shifted beneath the world they had grown up in. The family that had been the fixed point of their lives, the Fifth Avenue triplex, the Seasons in Southampton, the image of a mother and father at the center of something solid, was gone. Their mother moved into her own apartment on Fifth Avenue. The daughters moved with her. Almost immediately, they were swept into a world the press had a name for. The jet set, that fluid, international circuit of wealthy socialites, European aristocrats, American heiresses, and industrialists who spent their lives moving between Paris and St. Moritz and Monaco and New York. With a name like Ford and faces that photographed beautifully, Charlotte and Anne became fixtures in that world almost overnight. Charlotte was described at the time as one of the most famous heiresses in the world. As famous at a moment as Jackie Kennedy, one observer noted. She had made her debut in 1960 at a party in Grosse Pointe that cost roughly $250,000 and was described in the press as the party of the century. Anne's debut 2 years later received the same coverage and cost just as much. The press coverage of these events was not incidental. It was the media's signal that these were young women whose lives the public would be following. Gossip columns tracked who they were seen with. Weekly news magazines ran their photographs. They dated, collectively and separately, a wide variety of people from the jet-set world. European aristocrats, wealthy playboys, international figures whose presence in a room still meant something. Charlotte, by some accounts, was even seen with Frank Sinatra during those years, a detail her sister Anne would raise with a certain amused regularity in later years. Both were already used to the particular kind of celebrity that attaches to famous names. But after the divorce, that celebrity intensified. They were young, beautiful, independently wealthy, and entirely unmoored. And in the jet-set world of the mid-1960s, that was a combination that attracted a certain kind of attention. The men who came into their lives next would set the tone for a great deal of what followed. Charlotte, and the marriage that shocked the world. In December 1965, one of the most talked about weddings of the decade took place, not in a cathedral, not with fanfare, but in a motel suite in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, with a judge summoned to perform the ceremony. Charlotte Ford was 24 years old. Her groom was Stavros Niarchos. He was 56. Niarchos was one of the wealthiest men on the planet, a Greek shipping magnate who had built an empire of supertankers and whose fortune was estimated at more than $200 million in an era when that figure was barely comprehensible. He was also, by any measure, a complicated figure. He had been married 3 times before Charlotte. His most recent wife, Eugenia Livanos, with whom he had 4 children, had finalized a divorce from him just days before the wedding. Niarchos had sailed his enormous 3-masted schooner, the Creole, into Charlotte's life during the summer of 1964, when both families were yachting in the Mediterranean. The romance had developed in private. When the news broke, the world reacted with something between astonishment and fascination. Here was the daughter of one of America's most prominent industrial families, marrying a man 32 years her senior, in secret, in Mexico. The Ford family reportedly knew, though they had been urging that the whole affair be handled with discretion. Henry II, asked by a friend what he thought of his new son-in-law, replied simply that he was a very nice man. Charlotte was pregnant when they married. Their daughter Elena was born in May 1966. The marriage lasted less than 2 years. Charlotte filed for divorce in 1967 in Ciudad Juarez, the same city where they had married. Niarchos did not contest custody of Elena. The two had separated into different worlds almost immediately after the wedding, with Niarchos traveling constantly across Europe and Charlotte settling back into New York with their infant daughter. The honeymoon itself had contained an omen that went largely unremarked upon at the time. When the newlyweds arrived in St. Moritz, they could not stay in Niarchos's own chalet because his former wife, Eugenia, and their 4 children were already there. The couple checked into a hotel instead and moved through the days of their early marriage with the discretion that very large amounts of money can buy. That image, 2 newlyweds in a hotel while the previous family occupied the house, tells you something about the kind of arrangement Charlotte had walked into. The outcome for Eleanor was, in some ways, the bitterest part of the story. She grew up seeing almost nothing of her father. Niarchos died in April 1996 in Zurich, and when his will was opened, Elena's name was entirely absent. His estate was estimated at $12 billion. He left 20% to a charitable foundation bearing his name and the remainder to his children, from his marriage to Eugenia Livanos, to a nephew, and to a great-nephew. His daughter, by Charlotte, his own biological child, received nothing. Elena launched a legal challenge in Swiss and then Greek courts, claiming that as his biological daughter, she was entitled to a share of the estate. The Greek court ruled in 1997 that while Elena was indeed Niarchos's biological child, she had no legal inheritance rights under Greek law. The empire had closed its door. Charlotte went on to marry twice more, first to J. Anthony Forstmann of the textile family in 1973, a marriage that also ended in divorce, and then to Edward Down Jr. in 1986. She built a life as a fashion designer and etiquette author, launching the Charlotte Ford clothing collection in the late 1970s and publishing 2 best-selling books on modern manners. She served for decades on the board of New York Hospital. She sat on charitable committees and gave her time, in the way that women of her background and generation often did, to causes she actually believed in, rather than simply associating her name with them. When she was asked in 1978 whether she ever thought about taking a seat on Ford Motor Company's board, she said plainly that she had no desire to be on the board, and that besides, she had been born a girl, and that, she said, took care of that. The remark was made without particular bitterness. It was simply a statement of how the world had been organized when she came into it. Charlotte Ford died peacefully at her home in New York on December 21st, 2025. She was 84 years old. Her death was confirmed in an obituary that described her warmth, her elegance, and her unwavering devotion to those she loved. Her daughter Eleanor, who had once fought for a share of her father's fortune and lost, went on to become the first woman in the Ford family to hold an executive position at Ford Motor Company, serving as its chief customer experience officer. She once said her grandfather Henry Ford II had been her best friend, that he was the one who taught her to drive, insisting she learn on a manual transmission in his Ford F-100 pickup truck. The Ford legacy found its way back to Elena not through the Niarchos fortune she had fought for and lost, but through the grandfather who had always been there. But while Charlotte's story had those notes of resilience and eventual reconnection, her younger sister Anne's story was taking a very different kind of turn, one that had nothing to do with the jet set and everything to do with a small girl who couldn't read. Anne, the marriage, the daughter, and the battle no one saw coming. Anne Ford was the quieter one. 2 years younger than Charlotte, she had the same jet-set education, the same debutante circuit, the same social world. But where Charlotte had a certain calculated poise, Anne tended toward warmth and humour. She was the sister who laughed more easily, who made friends more quickly, who seemed, to people who knew both of them, less consumed by image. In December 1965, the same week Charlotte was secretly marrying Stavros Niarchos in Mexico, Anne married Giancarlo Uzielli, a handsome Italian-born stockbroker who had moved to New York in his teens. He was 30 years old. Anne was 22. Their father, Henry II, had not been especially enthusiastic about the match. Uzielli was a divorced man whose previous marriage had not yet been formally annulled, and the elder Fords were devout Catholics. But the civil ceremony went ahead in the Ford apartment, just 2 weeks after Charlotte's wedding. A detail the gossip columns could not resist, speculating that the younger sister had rushed to the altar to avoid being upstaged. Anne and Giancarlo had 2 children, a son, Alessandro, born in December 1966, and a daughter, Allegra, born in 1970. They lived a comfortable, socially active life in New York. The marriage lasted about a decade before coming apart. Anne filed for divorce in 1974, and afterward she was left to raise Alessandro and Allegra largely on her own. It was around that time, or perhaps a little earlier, as Allegra was approaching the age of 3, that something began to make Anne uneasy. Allegra was not developing the way her brother had. Certain things that should have come naturally were not coming. Certain things that other children seemed to absorb without effort, language, comprehension, the ability to process what was in front of them, seemed to require enormous struggle from Allegra. Anne took her to doctors. The doctors had different answers. Some were dismissive. Some offered diagnoses that felt incomplete. One, in what was perhaps the most callous moment in a process that had many of them, suggested that Allegra be institutionalized. Anne refused. In 1976, when Allegra was around 3 years old, she was formally diagnosed with severe learning disabilities. The specifics were complex. Her difficulties were significant enough that the professionals who assessed her used language that implied she would never live independently, never hold a job, never fully participate in the world that her family inhabited. Anne heard all of that. She heard every word of it. And then she went home and started looking for something better. What followed was not a single dramatic reversal. It was decades of patient, exhausting, often lonely work. Finding schools, finding tutors, finding specialists, attending conferences, building networks, pushing back against systems that were not designed to accommodate a child like Allegra. Some schools, she found, were too clinical, others were too dismissive. Some professionals gave her honest assessments she could work with. Others gave her language so cloaked in disclaimers that she left their offices having learned almost nothing useful. Anne would later write that she sometimes felt completely alone in what she was doing, that most of her friends with typically developing children couldn't fully understand what she was facing, and that the isolation of parenting a child with significant needs was something she hadn't anticipated and hadn't seen coming. She eventually told her mother about Allegra's disabilities, a conversation she had put off, and which turned out to be easier than she had feared, because her mother did what mothers and grandmothers do. She showed up. Anne's mother was with her on the hardest single day of those early years, when Anne took Allegra to a special education boarding school on Cape Cod, a day that Anne describes with a clarity that makes it feel like something that happened last week rather than decades ago. The thing that made Anne's story unusual, and this is worth holding on to, is what she did with that isolation. The advocate. By the late 1980s, Anne Ford had transformed herself into something nobody in her social world had expected: a full-time disability rights advocate. In 1989, she became chairman of the board of the National Center for Learning Disabilities, a position she would hold for 12 years until 2001. In that role, she led the organization through a period of significant expansion, opened a Washington, D.C. office, organized national educational summits, and worked alongside congressional representatives to push learning disability issues onto the national agenda. In 1994, she was appointed by the Department of Health and Human Services to its Commission on Childhood Disabilities as the representative for learning disabilities. She received the Lizette H. Sarnoff Award for volunteer service from the Albert Einstein College of Medicine and an honorary doctorate from Lesley University. None of it came easily, and none of it came because of the Ford name, or the money, or the connections. Though all of those things helped. It came because she had spent 15 years in the trenches of something that humbled her completely, and she had decided that if she had learned anything from it, other parents deserved to know what it was. In 2003, she published a book. She called it Laughing Allegra, a title that captured something important about the spirit of both the woman who wrote it and the daughter it was about. It was a memoir, candid and specific, about what it had actually meant to raise Allegra. The false starts, the failed schools, the moments of despair, the encounters with professionals who spoke in clinical language that left a mother feeling more lost than when she had walked in. It was also about what it had meant to find the right help, to watch her daughter grow and change, and find her footing in a world that had been slow to make room for her. Anne would say later that while writing it, she kept telling herself that no one would understand what she was describing, that the problems she was writing about were too specific, too interior, too particular to her own life to reach anyone else. The reality was the opposite. Almost every parent who read it had been through something they recognized. They just hadn't been talking about it either. The book was a finalist for the Books for a Better Life Award. It went into multiple editions. She wrote 3 more books after it: On Their Own, A Special Mother, and The Forgotten Child, each one reaching further into the territory she had come to know so well. She continued to speak publicly, to lobby quietly, to give the years of hard-won knowledge to people who were still at the beginning. Allegra eventually moved to upstate New York, where she built an independent life. She was married on May 5th, 2012. Her brother Alessandro has children of his own, and Anne became a grandmother. Anne Ford married twice more after Giancarlo Uzielli. once to the television newscaster Chuck Scarborough, a well-known face in New York broadcasting for decades, and once more after that. She was married 3 times in total, by her own account, and she writes about all of them in her later memoir, A Fascinating Life, with the dry humour that has always defined her. But through everything, the marriages, the divorces, the years of advocacy, the books, the public life and the private one, the thing that most defines Anne Ford's story is not the Ford name or the socialite image. It is the relationship between a mother and a daughter who was told she could not do things, and who did them anyway, because her mother refused to accept the first answer she was given. The father they lost twice. While Charlotte and Anne were navigating the lives they had built out of the wreckage of the jet-set years, their father was moving further and further into a world of his own making, and further from his daughters. Henry II had married Christina Vittore in 1965, the year his first wife, Anne MacDonald, finally got her divorce in Idaho. Christina was Italian-born, glamorous, internationally connected, and for a time she threw herself into the role of representing Ford Motor Company on the world stage with real energy. But the marriage deteriorated over time. Henry was restless, difficult, and relentlessly self-assured. Christina grew frustrated with the limitations of their life together. They separated in 1976, though the divorce was not finalized until 1980. By then, Henry had been with Kathleen DeRoss, known as Kathy, for several years. She was a former model from Detroit, a widow, a woman without inherited wealth or social standing in the circles Henry had inhabited his whole life. She was 23 years younger than him. She had met him at a party in 1969. In 1975, Henry had been arrested on suspicion of drunken driving on California's Pacific Coast Highway, with Kathy in the car alongside him. His response, which became one of the most quoted lines of his public life, was, "Never complain, never explain." He and Kathy married in Carson City, Nevada in 1980, the same year his divorce from Christina became final. The ceremony was quiet, held in a location Kathy had chosen based, according to those who knew her, on her belief in psychic guidance. Charlotte and Anne did not attend. Neither did their brother Edsel. The refusal was not impulsive. The daughters had been fond of Christina. They had maintained a relationship with her throughout the 1970s, even as that marriage collapsed. Kathy DeRoss was a different matter. She had come from a world that was entirely foreign to the one the Ford daughters had grown up in, and whatever their father's feelings for her, Charlotte and Anne could not make themselves stand there and watch him marry her. The estrangement that followed was real and lasted. Henry reportedly called Anne's apartment from Europe in the middle of the night, just days after the wedding. It was after 10 at night in New York, and well into the early hours of the morning where he was calling from, and made clear, in a way that only the late-night phone calls of difficult men can, how he felt about being left out in the cold by his own children. The rift never fully healed. When Henry Ford II died of pneumonia in Detroit at Henry Ford Hospital on September 29, 1987, his son Edsel and Kathy were at his bedside. Charlotte and Anne were not. He was 70 years old. His remains were cremated after a private service at Christ Church, Grosse Pointe. He had not asked for a grave marker. His will held one final shock. Henry had left his entire estate in trust to Kathy, with the income going to her for the rest of her life, and the remainder passing to his 6 grandchildren after her death. His 3 children, Charlotte, Anne, and Edsel, received nothing directly. In a video Will he had recorded 3 years before his death, he explained that this decision was not made for lack of love, but in light of the fact that his children were already wealthy and for tax reasons. He had apparently hoped the video would prevent the family from fighting over his estate. It did not. What followed was a legal battle between Kathy and her stepson Edsel over control of the trust. A battle that was eventually settled in 1988 under terms that were kept private, but that reportedly resulted in Kathy receiving an annual allowance of roughly $10 million for the rest of her life. By the time of her death in 2020, at the age of 80, the total amount drawn from the trust had reached into the hundreds of millions. Charlotte and Anne, who had each inherited wealth from other sources and who were never impoverished by their father's decision, nonetheless had to sit with the knowledge that the man who had built everything, the empire, the name, the world they had been born into, had reorganized his estate around the woman whose wedding they had refused to attend. There is something particularly difficult about that kind of estrangement. Not the financial part. Both sisters were by any measure comfortable. But the fact of being left out, deliberately and on the record, by your own father. The fact that the rupture over Kathy's wedding had hardened into something that outlasted him and was written into a legal document he recorded in private 3 years before his death, knowing his children would one day watch it. That is not a wound that money can reach. What the empire left behind. There is something that stands out when you look at these two lives from a certain distance. Charlotte and Anne Ford were raised to be ornaments of a world that valued beauty, social grace, the right marriages, and the right addresses. They were famous before they had done anything. They were photographed before they had made any choices. The world they were born into had an answer for everything. The right schools, the right debutante parties, the right families to marry into. But it had no particular interest in what they might become if the script ran out. The script ran out fairly quickly. The marriages of the 1960s collapsed. Their father's attention moved elsewhere. The jet-set world that had seemed so total and so permanent when they were in their 20s dissolved into something that only exists now in old magazine photographs. What remained was harder to photograph, but easier to live with. Charlotte channeled her energy into fashion, into etiquette, into community work, into being present for her daughter Elena through a childhood that involved a father who had vanished and a legal battle later for an inheritance that never came. She wrote books that people actually read and used. She served on hospital boards for 30 years. She stayed close to her sister through everything, the divorces, the estrangements, the passing of the generation that had defined the world they were born into. When she died in December 2025 at 84, the people who spoke about her most warmly were those who had known her not as the Ford heiress, but as a friend. Anne found something more unexpected, a daughter who needed a different kind of mother than the world had prepared her to be. A mother who would fight the medical establishment, navigate the systems, and sit with a child who was struggling, year after year, without giving up. She became that mother. And then she turned around and told every other parent in the same situation that they were not alone. There is a line Anne Ford has used, in various forms, across the years of her advocacy work. She talks about the confusion of the early days, the sense that she was facing something enormous on her own, that the people around her who hadn't been through it couldn't quite see what she was seeing. And she talks about how telling the story, however difficult it was to tell, was the only way to reach the parents who needed to hear it. That impulse, to take the private thing and make it useful, is not what anyone would have predicted from either of these women, based on the photographs in the magazine spreads of the 1960s. The famous heiresses in their debutante dresses, the daughters of the most powerful industrialist in America, the fixtures of the jet-set circuit. But the photographs are only ever one part of the story. And the parts that aren't photographed are usually the ones that matter most, the name that outlasted all of it. The Ford Motor Company is still operating today, still bearing the name that Henry Ford stamped on it in 1903, still making trucks and cars and, now, electric vehicles for a world that would be unrecognizable to the man who started it all. The family's hold on the company has loosened with each generation, as is natural. Control passed to boards and professionals long ago, though family members have remained involved. Edsel Ford II maintained his connection to the company, and Eleanor Ford, Charlotte's daughter, Henry II's granddaughter, the girl who lost her inheritance case in the Greek courts and found her way to a different kind of Ford legacy, became the first woman in the family to hold an executive position at Ford Motor Company. She was appointed Chief Customer Experience Officer in October 2018. In interviews, she has spoken about the bond she shared with her grandfather, Henry Ford II, the man she called her best friend, who taught her to drive a manual transmission in a Ford F-100 pickup truck. Whatever distance existed between Henry and his daughters in the final decade of his life, Elena carried forward a connection to him that was personal and warm, and something the legal battles and the estrangements and the contested wills did not reach. Charlotte lived long enough to see all of that. She lived long enough to see her daughter established in the family company, to see her grandchildren grow up, to see the story of the Ford sisters become a chapter in the longer history of an American dynasty still writing itself. She and Anne stayed close right through to the end. Still the same two girls who had padded around the Grosse Pointe Country Club in Madras shorts and read comics instead of classics. Still each other's constants in a world that had changed around them more times than they could count. When Anne Ford published A Fascinating Life, her memoir in recent years, she wrote about all of it. Her famous great-grandfather, the debutante balls, the voyages on the Mediterranean, the dinner with the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, teaching the twist at the White House, the adventures and the losses, the marriages and the divorces, Allegra, the work, the years. It is, by any measure, a life that earned its title. Henry Ford II, the man at the centre of all of it, left the world with his ashes scattered after a private service at Christ Church, Grosse Pointe. He had asked for no grave marker. The man who built one of the greatest empires in American industrial history took up no physical space in death. The daughters he left behind took up considerably more, not in the society pages where they had begun, but in the world of people who needed something real. Charlotte and Anne Ford were born into one of the most powerful families in American history. They were shaped by a father who ran an empire and a childhood that looked, from the outside, like a fairy tale. And they lived long enough to understand that fairy tales are mostly a story about what comes after the glamour fades. The marriages they made in their 20s did not last. The father they admired pulled away. The world that had been built for them, the yachts, the apartments, the debutante parties of the century, dissolved the way those worlds always do, quietly, while everyone is busy with something else. What remained was harder to photograph, but easier to live with. A daughter who fought for her inheritance and lost, and went to work for the family company instead. A sister who spent 30 years making sure other mothers didn't have to face the school systems alone. A close friendship between two women who had seen enough of the world to know that what they had in each other was worth more than most of what surrounded it. The empire is still there, bearing the name. The legacy, in its stranger and more personal form, is still being written. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. There is a palazzo in Venice where hundreds of thousands of people come every year to see the art. The Picassos, the Pollocks, the Dalís. They know the name on the door. What most of them don't know is what happened behind it. Peggy Guggenheim was the heiress, the collector, the patron who helped shape modern art. But she was also a mother, and the lives of her two children, a son named Sindbad and a daughter named Pegeen, tell a story that doesn't make it onto the museum plaques. This is that story, the world they were born into. To understand what happened to Sindbad and Pegeen, you have to start at the beginning, not just at their births, but at the world that was already waiting for them when they arrived. Peggy Guggenheim was born on August 26, 1898, in New York City, into one of the wealthiest Jewish families in America. The Guggenheims were mining and smelting industrialists, and their fortune was vast. Peggy's father was Benjamin Guggenheim, a man who loved luxury, women, and fine living. He was a presence in her early life. She later credited him with first sparking her interest in art during the family's summers in Europe. Then, in April of 1912, Benjamin Guggenheim boarded the RMS Titanic. He did not survive. He was 46 years old. Peggy was 13. She would later say she never fully got over losing him that way. And when you look at the rest of her life, the constant searching, the restlessness, the difficulty with steady love, it's hard not to think about that April night. After her father's death, Peggy inherited roughly $450,000. A similar sum came from her mother, Florette, who died in 1937. These inheritances made Peggy independently wealthy, though not on the colossal scale the Guggenheim name sometimes implied. She was rich enough to live freely, to collect art, to fund magazines and galleries and rescue missions. But she was not limitless, and she knew it. In 1919, in search of something her privileged New York upbringing couldn't give her, Peggy moved to Paris. She was 20 years old. Paris in the 1920s was the center of the artistic universe, a city crackling with writers, painters, thinkers, and experimenters of every kind. Peggy dove in completely. It was there that she met Lawrence Vail. He was American-born, Paris-raised, and something of a legend in the city's bohemian circles. He went by the nickname the King of Bohemia. He was handsome, wildly social, and completely unpredictable. He also drank heavily and had a violent temper that would reveal itself, over time, in ways that left a mark on everyone around him. Peggy and Lawrence were married in March 1922. Their son, Michael Cedric Sindbad Vail, known throughout his life simply as Sindbad, was born in London on May 15, 1923. Their daughter, Pegeen Jezebel Margaret Vail, followed on August 18, 1925, born in Ouchy, Switzerland. For a brief window, the family lived in the south of France, Pramusquier, near the coast. And Peggy would later write that despite everything, those early years had something wonderful in them. There were afternoons with Emma Goldman, evenings with Isadora Duncan, the easy, sun-warmed rhythm of the French countryside. But even in those seemingly golden days, the marriage was corroding. Lawrence drank. He raged. He humiliated Peggy in public, and worse, behind closed doors. By 1928, Peggy had fallen into an affair with a British writer named John Holmes and had made up her mind to leave. Sindbad was 5 years old. Pegeen was barely 3. The separation that followed was, in its own quiet way, the first major wound in both children's lives. The split that shaped everything. When a marriage ends with 2 young children in the middle of it, the choices made in those first months can ripple outward for decades. In the case of Sindbad and Pegeen, those choices were made quickly and without particular care for what the children might need. Lawrence took Sindbad. Peggy kept Pegeen. Just like that, a 5-year-old boy and his 3-year-old sister were separated. Not across town, but across different households, different countries, different lives. Peggy's granddaughter, Carola Vale, Sinbad's daughter, who would go on to become the director of the Peggy Guggenheim collection, later spoke about how this separation cast a long shadow over both of her father's and her aunt's lives. The two children, who should have had each other, simply didn't. The divorce was not finalized until 1930. In the years between and after, both children were raised largely by people who were not their parents. Nannies, tutors, boarding schools, and the general machinery of wealthy European childhoods filled in where presence was absent. Peggy was not cold or cruel in any deliberate way, but she was absorbed in her lovers, her ideas, her art, and her social world. Sindbad, living with his father, had his own difficulties. Lawrence Vale, for all his charm, was not a man built for parenthood. It should be said that Lawrence Vale was not a straightforwardly bad father in the way that some accounts imply. He did write about his children, he did think about them, and in his later years he reflected, sometimes painfully, on where things had gone wrong. But he was a man whose own needs and impulses consistently came first, whose drinking made him unpredictable, and whose vision of life centered on himself in ways that left the people around him perpetually adjusting. A child raised in that environment learns early on to read the room, to manage the mood, to anticipate and accommodate. That is not the same as growing up feeling safe. Peggy's connection to Sindbad was always somewhat distant. She wrote in her memoirs that she felt she had little in common with him, aside from a strong physical resemblance. That is a remarkable thing for a mother to write about her own child, and it says something about the emotional register Peggy operated in. She was not dishonest about it. She simply didn't know what to do with that distance. After the divorce, Peggy moved to England with John Holmes. She settled into a kind of domestic life that was, for her, almost unrecognizable. There were houses in Hampshire and Devon, gardens and fireside evenings, bedtime stories read to Peggin and to Debbie, the daughter of her companion Douglas Garman. Carole Vale, who would later research her grandmother's life extensively, described this period as the nearest Peggy ever came to something like a normal existence. She was trying, in her way, to be a mother. The trouble was that she had been raised by nannies and governesses herself. She had no real template for what intimacy between a parent and a child was supposed to look like. John Holmes died suddenly in January 1934 after a minor surgical procedure went wrong. He was in his mid-30s. For Peggy, it was a devastating blow, and it pulled her further out of the domestic orbit she had been tentatively inhabiting. The life of a homemaker, of a hands-on, present, settled mother, drifted further and further away. Peggin, who had been with her mother through those English years, would carry that period inside her. She had been close to Peggy in those days, closer than they would ever really be again, in the same uncomplicated way. As both of them grew older, the relationship became more tangled, more charged, more painful, for reasons that would take years to fully emerge. And Sindbad, meanwhile, was growing up in a different kind of absence. One not of distance, exactly, but of direction. A boy raised by a charming, restless, difficult father, separated from his mother and his sister, in a world that had glamour and culture in abundance and stability almost nowhere. What that does to a person, what it builds in them, and what it leaves hollow, becomes clearer as both of their lives unfold. Sindbad, the son who drifted. Sindbad Vale spent his life being the less discussed child. In almost every account of Peggy Guggenheim's story, he appears as a footnote. Her son, yes, the one who lived. Peggin was the dramatic one, the artist, the tragedy. Sindbad was the one who just sort of kept going. But keep going is not the same as doing well. As a young man, Sinbad made his way into the same Parisian expat world that had defined his parents' generation, though the version he inhabited was less brilliant and more dissolute. By the late 1940s and into the 1950s, he was a recognizable figure in the literary crowd of Paris, the circles that included Terry Southern and Mason Hoffenberg, and the various restless Americans who had wound up in France after the war. He had a certain charm, a quick mind, and the easy, worldly manner that came from having grown up among artists and intellectuals. Peggy funded a literary magazine for him called Points, which he began publishing in 1949. Over the course of its run, it featured work by writers including Brendan Behan, Mordecai Richler, and Alexander Trocchi, genuine literary figures of the era. As publishing ventures go, it was not without real merit. Sindbad had taste. He had his mother's instinct for being near interesting people. What he didn't have, or didn't develop, at least not in any sustained way, was the disciplined ambition that turns good taste into something lasting. He married twice. His first wife was Jacqueline Ventadour, his second, Peggy Angela Yeomans, whom he married in 1957. With her, he had 4 children, one of whom was Carole Vale. He lived out much of his adult life in Europe, moving between cities, passing time doing the things he apparently found most satisfying: fast cars, billiards, and drink. He was, by most accounts, pleasant company. He was also, by most accounts, not particularly ambitious or driven. His relationship with Peggy remained complicated. In her autobiography, she wrote plainly about the emotional gap between them. He was her son. She cared about him, and she helped him financially. The magazine is evidence enough of that. But there was never the kind of closeness that she would describe in raw and aching terms when she wrote about Pegane. When Pegane died in 1967, Sindbad was 43 years old. He outlived his sister by nearly 20 years. He died in 1986 at the age of 63 of cancer. He left behind his children, including Carola, who would go on to curate exhibitions about her grandmother and eventually run the Venice collection, keeping the Guggenheim name alive in ways that Sindbad himself, for all his quiet drifting, perhaps never imagined possible. There is something quietly poignant about Sindbad's relationship with his mother's world. He was the child of 2 people who had placed themselves at the absolute center of 20th century Bohemian culture, and he had grown up watching the whole performance from the front row. He knew the artists, he knew the language, he had his mother's instinctive pull toward interesting people and ideas. But knowing the world and inhabiting it on your own terms are 2 very different things, and Sindbad never fully bridged that gap. What he did have, by all accounts, was a certain ease. He was liked by people who knew him. He was not embittered by his mother's fame or destroyed by the instabilities of his childhood, at least not visibly. He married twice and had 4 children and lived his life in Europe with something that looked, from the outside, like contentment. Whether it felt like contentment from the inside is something only he would have known, and he left no memoirs. His story is not one of spectacular catastrophe. It is quieter than that, more of a slow, gentle subsiding. A life with real possibilities that never quite found its shape. A man who grew up at the edges of greatness and genius, and who, in the end, lived his own life on his own modest terms. There is something worth sitting with in that, even if it's not the story that tends to get told. Because while Sindbad drifted, his sister was burning, and that is where the story turns. Pegeen, the artist in the shadow. From the time she could hold a brush, Pegeen painted. She was not a hobbyist or a dilettante. She was a genuine artist, one whose work combined the loose, dreamlike imagery of surrealism with the flatness and directness of so-called naive art. Her paintings are populated by doll-like figures in colourful, suspended scenes, parks, gardens, living rooms, weddings. At first glance, they look joyful, almost childlike in their simplicity. But look longer, and something else comes through. The figures have a certain stillness to them. Their eyes, when you catch them, hold a distance. The happiness in the paintings feels preserved rather than lived, like something behind glass. She first exhibited publicly at the age of 12, when Peggy included her in a group exhibition of children's art at her London gallery Guggenheim Jeune in the autumn of 1938. That same summer, Péguine exchanged works with the surrealist painter Yves Tanguy, a man 35 years her senior, one of the leading figures in the movement. She was 12 years old. That tells you something about both the environment she grew up in and the genuine precocity of her talent. In 1941, when the war made staying in Europe impossible, Péguine left France with her mother and Max Ernst, who had recently become Peggy's lover and would soon become her second husband. They arrived in New York, where Péguine enrolled at the Lenox School. She was 16. She was also, already, navigating a family situation that was more complicated than most adults would know what to do with. The transatlantic crossing was not just a physical journey. It was also a severing. From the life in France, from the Europe that had been Péguine's entire world up to that point, from whatever fragile routines she had built. In New York, the family moved into a mansion near the East River that Peggy had taken for herself and Ernst. It was a large, eccentric household in a city that was exciting but foreign. Péguine was a teenager who had been raised across the French countryside and the English South, and she was now living in Midtown Manhattan with her mother's new partner, and the peripheral chaos of Peggy's social life swirling constantly around them. Max Ernst was a towering figure of surrealism, celebrated, compelling, magnetically strange. He was also a man who had accumulated women with the same energy that Peggy accumulated art. Multiple sources, including biographical accounts of Péguine's life, note that the dynamic between Péguine and her stepfather carried an awkward and troubling undercurrent. Accounts describe an uncomfortable closeness that crossed into inappropriate territory. And while the full picture is not entirely clear from the historical record, it is something that several people close to the family acknowledged. For a teenage girl in an already unstable domestic situation, that kind of confusion, layered on top of everything else, would leave marks. By 1943, Péguine was exhibiting at Peggy's New York gallery, Art of This Century, as part of a group show of women artists. 2 years later, in 1945, she had her own solo exhibition there. She was 20 years old. The art world noticed. Her work was distinctive. No one else was making quite what she was making. Figures from her life, recognizable to those who knew her, appeared in her paintings in that rounded, slightly removed style. Her mother, her husbands, her children, herself. It is worth pausing here to acknowledge what it meant for Péguine to be exhibiting in her mother's gallery, a complicated position by any measure. Critics, who might otherwise have taken her work seriously, sometimes dismissed it because of the nepotism they assumed was at play. Péguine spent years working against that assumption, travelling to cities where her mother's name carried less weight, submitting her work independently, trying to build a reputation that could stand on its own. It was an exhausting project, carried on alongside everything else her life required of her, and it speaks to something genuinely stubborn and determined in her character, that she kept at it as long as she did. She painted her own wedding in 1946, the year she married the French painter Jean Hélion. The painting shows the figures at a ceremony, bright and still. What it does not show is what was happening inside: two marriages, four sons, and a life unraveling. Jean Hélion was a respected figure in the Parisian art world, a painter who had helped bring abstract art to America alongside Piet Mondrian and Fernand Léger. He and Pégane married in New York in 1946. They moved to Paris the same year. Over the course of the following decade, they had three sons together: Fabrice, David, and Nicholas. But the marriage was not a happy one. Pégane suffered from depression. It had been following her since adolescence, since the boarding schools and the separations, and the particular kind of loneliness that comes from being raised on the periphery of a very bright light. She sought psychoanalysis in the early 1950s. She drank. The drinking made the depression harder to manage. The depression made the drinking harder to stop. She and Hélion separated by the mid-1950s. When they did, the pattern of the previous generation repeated itself with a kind of grim precision. Pégane kept the youngest son, Nicholas, and left the older boys, Fabrice and David, with their father. The family broke along the same lines it had in Peggy's own divorce. Children divided, siblings separated, the shape of a family rearranged by the practicalities of collapse. In 1957, Pégane accompanied her mother to London for the opening of a Francis Bacon exhibition at the Hanover Gallery. It was there that she met Ralph Rumney, an English painter and one of the co-founders of the Situationist International, a radical artistic and political movement that challenged the cultural and social assumptions of post-war Europe. Rumney later said it was love at first sight, at least on his part. Peggy Guggenheim hated him. She had wanted Pégane to marry an English aristocrat, someone stable, someone established, someone who came with the right kind of credentials. Rumney was a penniless avant-garde artist with no money, no title, and no interest in pretending otherwise. Peggy called him terrible. She used that word repeatedly and without qualification. Her son Sandro, the child Pégane and Rumney would have together, born in 1958, later recalled that his grandmother had a particular talent for making his mother cry, and that she had tormented Pégane and pushed Rumney to the margins of the family's world. Pégane and Rumney married in 1958. Sandro was born the same year. In 1959, the family moved to Paris, where they lived first on the Rue du Dragon and then on the Ile Saint-Louis. By all accounts, Rumney loved Pégane genuinely and understood something about her artistic mind that others didn't. He called her an artist who lived her art, a phrase that sounds like a compliment, and was, though it also captured something about how consuming the internal life was for Pégane, how little buffer there was between what she felt and what she was. In Paris, the depression deepened. Rumney was also struggling. He drank, his finances were erratic, and the pressure of watching someone you love move in and out of crisis without being able to stop it is its own kind of damage. Pégane had made multiple attempts to end her life over the years. Peggy herself described one of those occasions in her memoir, an episode that interrupted a dinner party with blood and horror. Rumney, too, had been the one to intervene on more than one of those nights. The years passed. Pégane kept painting. In the early 1960s, she struck up a creative partnership with Egidio Costantini, a renowned Murano glassmaker who had created sculptures for Picasso and Chagall. Together, they produced a series of glass sculptures made from Pégane's drawings. They were beautiful objects, translucent and strange, the way her paintings had always been. By 1966, after years of being ignored or condescended to by critics who couldn't separate her work from her mother's name, Pégane was finally gaining traction on her own terms. She had exhibitions in Canada, in Stockholm, in Philadelphia. The work was being seen. The world was beginning, however late, to meet her on her own ground. She was 41 years old. March 1st, 1967. The winter of 1967 found Pegeen in Paris, in the apartment on the Ile Saint-Louis she shared with Rumney and their son Sandro, who was 9 years old. The specific details of what happened are not entirely clear, and in the decades since, they have been coloured by grief and accusation and the particular way that traumatic events resist simple narration. What is known is this. On March 1st, 1967, Ralph Rumney found Pegeen unresponsive in their apartment. She had taken an overdose of barbiturates. She was 41 years old. She was gone. Peggy was in Mexico when the telegram arrived. She had been travelling, which was itself a kind of habit by then, movement as a way of filling the spaces that kept opening up. She later wrote, in words that carry an unmistakable rawness, that there had been no one in the world she loved so much, that she felt as if the light had left her life. She described Pegeen as having been, to her, not just a daughter, but a mother, a friend, and a sister. Those words have always struck people who read them as profound and, at the same time, a little revealing. Because if Pegeen had become a mother figure to her own mother, if the emotional labour had, at some point, reversed itself in that way, then something about what Pegeen's life had required of her becomes clearer. What followed Pegeen's death was, in some ways, as painful as the death itself. Peggy refused to accept that what happened was a deliberate act on Pegeen's part. She turned that grief outward, toward Rumney. She told people he was responsible. She used her lawyers, her money, and her influence to press the French authorities to investigate him. Rumney was questioned briefly. There was no prosecution, because there was no evidence of wrongdoing. Rumney had loved Pegeen. He had, by multiple accounts, done what he could to keep her alive through years of crisis. Now he was being accused of her death by a woman with almost limitless resources and a bottomless supply of lawyers. Peggy also took Sandro. The 9-year-old boy was removed from Rumney's care. Rumney did not have the means to fight it. He spent years separated from his son. Sandro eventually grew up and sought his father out on his own, reportedly working through a phone directory, calling every person named Rumney in London until he found him. The accusations against Rumney were never proven because they were not true. His name was eventually cleared, but the damage to his life and to Sandro's childhood was already done. In the room at her Venice palazzo that Peggy dedicated to Pegeen's paintings, the canvases still hang. The figures in them are bright and still. The parks and gardens and wedding scenes, the doll-like people in their frozen moments of happiness. You can visit them today. They are part of the permanent collection, the weight that Peggy carried. For the 12 years that remained of Peggy Guggenheim's life after Pegeen's death, she was not quite the same. She continued to live in Venice, in the Palazzo Venier dei Leoni on the Grand Canal. She continued to receive guests and hold court and tend to her collection. She continued to be, in the public sense, Peggy Guggenheim. But the social circle thinned, the energy quieted, and the losses accumulated. The dogs she kept and loved so fiercely died one by one, and she stopped replacing them, which those close to her recognized as a kind of signal. In 1974, 5 years before her death, the Louvre held a major exhibition of her collection. It was one of the greatest honors the art world could extend, and it happened. The collection that the Louvre had once declined to help her hide from the Nazis was now being shown in its own halls. Peggy attended. She was 75. Whatever private feelings she had about the symmetry of that moment, she kept them to herself. She donated her palazzo to the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation in the 1970s. and then the collection, ensuring it would remain intact and accessible in Venice rather than be sold off or dispersed. It was one of the most genuinely generous acts of her life, and it was deliberate. She wanted the collection to outlast her. She wanted the art to keep being seen. There is something worth noting here, which is that Peggy was not a simple figure. The woman who could write with such raw honesty about her failures as a mother, who admitted in print that she hadn't known how to give her daughter what she needed, that she'd been emotionally unavailable, that she'd watched Peggy suffer and not always known how to reach her, was also the woman who turned on Rumney after the death with a ferocity that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with grief that had nowhere else to go. She was a woman capable of enormous generosity and enormous damage, sometimes toward the same people, sometimes at the same time. That contradiction doesn't resolve neatly. It just sits there, the way real things about real people tend to. Ralph Rumney, Pegin's second husband and the co-founder of the Situationist International, died in 2002. His obituary in The Guardian described the accusation that had been levelled against him as unforgivable. He had spent the years after Pegin's death fighting to be recognised as something other than the villain in someone else's story. Sinbad, for his part, outlived his sister and his mother both. He died in 1986, 17 years before his father Lawrence, who had died back in 1968 in Cannes. Sinbad's daughter Carola has spent her career keeping the family's complicated legacy alive in the most constructive way she could find. By being the director of the collection her grandmother spent a lifetime assembling. What the paintings know. There's a particular painting in the Peggy Guggenheim collection that most visitors walk past without stopping. It's called My Wedding. Peggy made it in 1946, the year she married Jean Hélion. It shows figures at a ceremony. Bright, rounded, painted in that style of hers that hovers between innocence and something harder to name. The people in it are happy, or they appear to be. The colours are warm. The scene is festive. Peggy was 20 years old when she painted it. By the time she was in her mid-30s, the marriage it commemorates would be over, and she would be searching for something else, some other shape that life might take. Her paintings are full of scenes like that. People in gardens, people by the sea, children playing, women in profile, figures arranged around tables or in parks or standing at windows, all of them contained in their moments of brightness, none of them quite making eye contact with you, none of them quite breaking through the surface. It takes a moment to realize that what Peggy was painting, over and over again in different colors and different arrangements, was the life she wanted. Not the one she had. The separations, the instability, the depression, the loneliness, the complicated love of a mother who was too big and too consuming and too present in all the wrong ways and absent in all the ones that mattered most. But the one she kept reaching toward, the one with warmth and stillness and people who stayed. She never painted chaos. She never painted grief. Everything in her work is suspended in a kind of impossible calm. When you know her story, that feels less like peace and more like longing, a legacy with two faces. The Peggy Guggenheim collection receives close to 500,000 visitors every year. They come from all over the world to stand in the palazzo on the Grand Canal and look at the art. And the art is extraordinary. One of the finest collections of 20th century modernism anywhere on the planet. Picasso, Braque, Dalí, Ernst, Kandinsky, Pollock, Rothko, Calder, Mondrian. The names read like a condensed history of everything that mattered in Western art between 1910 and 1960. Peggy assembled all of it. She had the eye, the money, the nerve, and the connections. She understood what was happening in modern art before most institutions did, and she put her resources behind it without hesitation. The artists she supported, particularly Jackson Pollock, whom she recognized and funded before anyone else in America was paying serious attention, went on to reshape what art could be. Her contribution to that story is real and lasting, but the collection also contains a room that most guidebooks mention only briefly, if at all. It is the room dedicated to Pegin's paintings. The two legacies exist side by side in the same building. The mother's, vast, celebrated, world famous, and the daughter's, quiet, overlooked, still in the process of being understood. Pegin's work has begun, in recent years, to receive the kind of attention it always deserved. A posthumous exhibition at the Peggy Guggenheim Collection ran from October 2010 to March 2011, featuring 5 of her paintings and 2 of the glass sculptures she made with Costantini. Scholars and curators have begun to write about her as an artist in her own right, not just as a footnote in her mother's biography. The first biography of Pegeen Vale was published in 2010, written by her son, Benjamin Hellion, and his collaborator, Benjamin Lanoux. It was called Pegeen Vale Guggenheim, A Life Through Art. It was the first sustained attempt to give her back her own story. Sinbad's legacy is quieter still. He left behind children and grandchildren, including Caroli Vale, who now runs the collection with a curator's precision and a granddaughter's intimate knowledge of what it cost to build. Whatever distance existed between Sindbad and his mother during their lifetimes, something of him persists in that building on the Grand Canal. In the family name, in the granddaughter who showed up and stayed, in the continuity that outlasted all of them. Peggy Guggenheim died on December 23, 1979, after a stroke. She was 81 years old. She was cremated, and her ashes were interred in the garden of her palazzo, in a corner near the graves of her beloved dogs. She chose that spot deliberately. The woman who had spent her life at the center of the art world, who had dined with Picasso and championed Pollock, and navigated the most explosive decades in modern cultural history, wanted to be buried in her garden, with her dogs. The palazzo opened to the public again within days of her death, just as she had arranged. The art, as she had intended, stayed. Peggy Guggenheim left the world one of its great art collections. That is an undeniable fact. The beauty she preserved, and the artists she made possible. That story has been told many times and deserves to be, but her children's lives are part of the story too. Sinbad, the son who drifted and never quite found his footing, but who raised a daughter who turned out to be exactly what the family needed. And Pegeen, the painter who spent her life reaching for a calm she couldn't quite hold, who made work of real and lasting beauty, and who left the world at 41, before she got to see what might have come next. They were both shaped by the same forces, a brilliant, consuming, emotionally complicated mother, a volatile father, a childhood divided across continents and households, a world that was glamorous and chaotic in equal measure, and that asked nothing of them directly except to survive it. Sinbad did, in his quiet way. Pegeen almost did. What often gets lost in the telling of Peggy Guggenheim's story, in all the excitement about the art and the affairs and the daring and the legacy, is the cost of it. Not just to Peggy herself, who paid her own prices, but to the 2 small people who were born into that story and had to find their footing inside it without being asked whether they wanted to. Children don't choose the circumstances of their beginning. They just begin, and then they spend the rest of their lives working out what to do with what they've been handed. Sindbad was handed a famous mother who felt closer to him physically than emotionally, a father who was brilliant and destructive in roughly equal measure, and a world full of interesting people who were never quite as interested in him. He took what he had and built a quiet life and left behind children who carry the name forward with dignity. Pegeen was handed all of that, plus a particular sensitivity that made everything hit harder. The art she made out of it, those bright, still, suspended scenes of happiness, is one of the genuinely moving things in this story. That she kept painting through all of it, that she kept reaching for something lighter, that the work she was making in 1966, in the last year of her life, was the best and most recognized work of her career. There is a photograph taken sometime in the late 1950s, now held as part of the family archive. In it, Pegeen is standing somewhere in Venice, near the water, in the kind of soft light the city does in the late afternoon. She is looking slightly away from the camera. She looks, if you had to put a word to it, like someone in the middle of a thought, present, and not quite present at the same time. It is the kind of photograph that stays with you, not because anything dramatic is happening in it, but because of what you know. Because you know what's coming, and she doesn't. Her paintings are in that palazzo. They are still hanging there, bright and still, full of the life she was always reaching toward. Go see them if you can. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.